You are listening to Preconceived, where we examine the preconceptions that shape how we view the world and the paradigms by which we live our lives.
Hey everybody, I'm Zael Mednick, and welcome to another episode of Preconceived. Today we're talking about sexual misconduct and sexual abuse. I'll be chatting with Timothy Mousseau, who is a survivor of sexual assault himself and who has spoken across the United States and abroad regarding this topic. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Tim, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, Zael, thanks for having me and for having this conversation. I know it's an important one.
Absolutely. We've touched on it in a couple episodes before, but I'm glad to have an expert like you to join the podcast because it's, first of all, such a timely topic to discuss as we're going through, sounds weird to say, as we're going through the Me Too movement, but as this has taken form and somebody who's spoken on it nationally and is well respected in this area. So I'm so glad to have you on.
Absolutely.
So you have experience with sexual abuse. Tell me a little bit about that and how that got you involved in speaking about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, I think as with anyone who experiences sexual violence, it was entirely unexpected, right? And so it happened at the age of 22. I was kind of finishing up my master's degree, working in training and development. And I kind of had this mindset of I loved educating people, leading leadership programs, all of that kind of stuff. And then one day I was sitting at work and I received an anonymous letter in the mail. And so the first letter, it was just, a single piece of paper. And it was a note essentially talking about how in college, one of my good friends had died by suicide. And the note told me that the world would be a better place if I killed myself over them.
Whoa.
And so I read that over and, was furious and upset and hurt. And I was also confused about why someone would do that. And that essentially led to just a pattern of stalking and abuse. So I started, these letters became pretty constant. Every few weeks they would come. They were always anonymous. I had no idea who was sending them. And the person who was doing it wanted to cause me emotional harm. They were very derogatory and demeaning. They also wanted to kind of exert this degree of control. They knew things about my past. They knew things about my present. And this went on for a few months. And then finally, one day things changed. My job at the time, we hosted a number of very well publicized conferences. And a few days after we came back from one of those conferences, I received a piece of mail from the hotel we'd been staying at. And this time my name was written out and the hotel's address was in the return address spot. So I knew where it was coming from. And I thought it was just a normal piece of mail. But inside were actually pictures of me being sexually assaulted. And since I have tattoos, we know that it's me beyond a reasonable doubt in the photos. The tattoos also kind of show that I was likely 19 years old when they were taken. And then basically my body is very limp and lifeless. So we know I was likely drugged. And I had no recollection of this. So I had no memory this had happened to me. This is something that I wasn't aware of. And so I all of a sudden found out about this incident of assault and had to come to terms with the fact that this was something that occurred.
Oh my God.
Top of that, and on top of that, it was coming to my work, and so I was like, I'm going to call the police. Well, I decided, hey, I need to tell my boss if I'm calling the police to the place of work, I need to give him some kind of explanation. And the organization had always been toxic. It was, very just kind of a unhealthy organization. My boss had a lot of power. He was really well known in our industry. He was very well celebrated, and he kind of created this really messed up dynamic. But with that, it became even worse, where I thought it was going to be, supportive or some degree of help. And instead he, shamed me. He asked me, are you sure this isn't something you did to yourself for attention? And he told me things like, you should make sure no one finds out about this because you'll probably never get a job. And so for the next few months, essentially my life then became grappling with my identity, having experienced sexual violence and figuring out what that meant. And also feeling entirely unsafe in my place of work, of knowing that there's this person stalking me who I had no idea who they were, who wanted to cause me harm, and it never escalated to physical harm beyond the letters. And then I also had to deal with this boss who would use it in these kind of ways of anytime there was any pushback or anytime I did something that he didn't like, it would be kind of this private meeting where we call me into his office and kind of basically just use it as a way of kind of hinting at well, I know this thing about you and you should make sure no one finds out about this. And it just became extremely abusive. And so I got out of there as soon as I could. It was part of my last kind of component of my master's degree. And so I just left. The second I finished, I quit. And I had no idea what I was going to be doing. And I had a mentor who had been doing speaking and training and development. And he was kind of like, hey, like, you're good at that. Why don't you do that full time? And very quickly, a few months into doing that, I kind of realized I need to talk about sexual violence. There was this lack of public understanding around it. And for a while, I was kind of in a perspective of, I don't want to share my identity. I don't want to talk about this. I want to be over it. And then as I kind of just watched the collective conversation around it, I was like, I need to share this story, because I think there were so many things that I never heard as a survivor that I wish other people were hearing. And even just thinking back to my college experience and my high school and just growing up, there were so many ways that people were talking about it that just seemed wrong or out of touch or just didn't seem realistic for survivors or in preventing it. So that kind of motivated me to start to research it and work with it and really figure out how to try and make a change.
That is a harrowing story.
Yeah.
I mean, like you articulated there, you're struggling with dealing with this past that you had no idea about. In the meantime, you're also trying to deal with your present situation, which is being aggravated by this revelation of the past, which you revealed thinking it was the right thing to do to your boss. And there's just so many layers there.
Yeah. It is my story is very unique, and I think there's just also so much commonality with so many other survivors of just when you experience an assault, when you feel the shame around it, there's this large degree of stigma. I think so many survivors have this fear of coming forward because you hear stories like that, or you see examples where you turn to people you think you can trust, and I'm fortunate at the time I was 22. And so I had a little bit more understanding and awareness at that point in life. And even then I was still completely unprepared for any of the reactions. And there was people who I thought, oh, these people will be supportive, or these people will be, there for me. And it was just kind of still lacking in so many ways.
Did you ever find out who wrote you those letters and who was sending those pictures? And did it stop?
So they did stop. I never figured out. For a while, I tried to hire a private detective because the police basically couldn't do anything either. So that was the other side of it. It's like the police were essentially, I had photographic evidence in hand, and their question for me is, well, do you fear for your personal life right now? Like, is your safety in threat? And I was like, well, no. And they're like, well, we can't do anything. And that was just like mind blowing of like, I have this documented evidence. And they're like, well, it didn't happen in our state, likely, all that kind of piece. And so I did hire a private detective, and we were never able to track down who it was. Like, I think at the time I had limited resources, and so I may be able to go back and find it out. But eventually it became this piece of, I don't know if it would be healthy for me to, because there's also this degree of like lack of closure that could happen. The legal process behind it is pretty out of date. And so it's just such a murky case that I was like, I don't know if nowadays maybe I could go back and try and trace that person down, but I don't know if it would help me or help in those kind of regards.
So how do you get through that when you're trying to piece together something where you don't have any recollection of? How do you come to grips with that and try to make some sense of that? Because I can't imagine getting a letter with pictures like that. And it's scary that there are probably pictures of that exist of a lot more people who get them sent to them.
Yeah. In the beginning, it wasn't necessarily healthy. I used drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism. I was isolated. I cut off a lot of people from my life because I really didn't know who to trust. And then over time, like finally, my mom was actually the person who tried to convince me to go to a therapist, because she was just like, I'm worried about you. I'm worried about you hurting yourself, hurting someone else accidentally. So she just like begged me to go once. And it helped. It was hard. It was difficult. It wasn't perfect. It's not like I went to a therapist and that was it. There was still panic attacks. There was still trauma. There was still pain. Another thing that helped is that therapist did connect me with a survivor support group. And so that was the first time I ever talked to other survivors who were just able to talk about their experience. And I found that very cathartic, because I think there was this degree of, let's heal together, and there's not a ton of like judgment, right? Like it wasn't like people were trying to tell you what to do. It was just like, this is awful, and we have this shared experience and this shared identity, and we can come together, connect, sit down, talk about that, but also just recognize the humanity in each other. And then it was a lot of other things. I mean, it was a lot of, just small behavior changes, figuring out what it meant for me to feel safe again, how to protect myself, how to protect my identity, figuring out how to sleep again was a huge piece of it. For a while, there was like nightmares and panic attacks. And so it was like kind of navigating like, okay, what's going to cause me to have a panic attack? Are there things I can remove in those degree? And so it took a long time to figure out like, what does normal look like?
I can't imagine. And with a lot of problems that people encounter in life, at least you have facts that you can lean on. and
Yeah.
you can try to make sense of stuff. But when you're just left with so many unknowns, it magnifies all those challenges, I'm sure.
Yeah, because I think there was a long time where I felt like I was going insane because I had this evidence that kind of showed pretty clearly what happened to me, and I didn't have any recollection of it. And it was very hard not to get caught up in just obsessing over what could have happened or what might have happened or all of those kind of pieces, right? Of like just looking at the photographs gave a pretty vivid picture, but it was always this kind of piece of, was there something else or something more? And, part of it was just trying to do what I could, of, even though it was years later, like I still went to the hospital and got tested, of like making sure I was safe and, nothing was wrong there. But it was just all this kind of mix of, sometimes a large part of the healing process, I think, was letting go of some of that unknown, of not knowing what happened to me, and eventually coming to the place of like, I don't think it's ever okay, but it's better.
A lot of people, maybe prior to the Me Too movement or with a lesser understanding of sexual assault, and I'm sure you've heard this, and I'm sure you have had these thoughts go through your mind as you were grappling with it, would say, well, you were in a state where you shouldn't have been in that led you to that situation. And that must be really, really hard when you were considering that, and if people ever suggested that to you. How did you get past that? And I think that's a really important and apt aspect of sexual abuse to talk about, because that's one of those areas where people in the past might have not even considered that sexual abuse.
Yeah, I think that, and that was certainly, right? Like there was a huge part of me that, because people sometimes would ask, like, well, how did you not know? Right. And there was a part of me in college that it wasn't necessarily frequent, but there were times where I drank to the point of blackout. Right. And so there was always that shame for myself of, if I had not done that, would that not have happened to me? Would someone have not been able to engage in that predatory behavior? And I think you hear that so often with sexual violence, especially, as well, if so-and-so hadn't been in this situation, or so-and-so hadn't been doing these things. And I think it's really unique because it is the only crime where we really do that. Like, I think if you look at any other crime, it's like, hey, if you're walking down the street and a drunk driver hits you on the way to the grocery store, in a sidewalk, no one goes, well, why were you getting groceries? You know what I mean? Even if you have been drinking, right? There's that degree of like, well, they were in the sidewalk, they were following the rules. I think part of it was separating why people choose to engage in violence versus what I experienced. And this is, I think, a thing that a lot of times people miss. The person who did what they did to me is a predator. And they didn't do that because of sex. They did that because of power and control. That's, we know that based on what they did to me, as well as the letters and taking the photographs and trying to use those to hurt me. People who choose to engage in sexual violence do it because of power and control. I think the place where a lot of people get caught up is, unless you're asexual, everyone engages in sexual activity at some point in their lifetime. Generally, we do it for intimacy or for pleasure or a mix of those things. And I think one of the things that makes sexual violence really hard is we hear the sex term, and that's where our mind gravitates. And so we look at it as, well, I engage in sex, I engage in these same activities or some variation of these activities. And that's why a lot of times when you hear accusations come forward, people will be like, were you sure there wasn't a misreading? Are you sure there wasn't, it wasn't, how could you not know? Or was it the victim's fault? Because we get so caught up on the sex piece, we don't think about the violence piece. And we don't always necessarily assign the motives to that degree of, hey, people who choose to do this are wanting to engage in that harm, and they're wanting to cause harm, and they're wanting to use power and control. And then I think the other side of things is also what happens in a lot of like cases we're hearing, is where there is sometimes a lot of gray area. And so that's another piece we see, is like, for me, it's a very clear degree of like, this person was a perpetrator. They did this in predatory ways. They knew what they were doing. They saved that information to use against me later. They wanted to hurt me. And I think a lot of times where other people get caught up is the degree of like, this was a consensual relationship for some of it, or, there was some of those other pieces where it's a little more gray. And again, we focus on the sex piece, but we don't always focus on the violence piece. Even if the violence wasn't necessarily intentional, the harm that violence causes and what that means for someone to go through that and undergo that.
I think talking about the gray is really important, and that's what a lot of people struggle with in this conversation. To have a better informed conversation, I think it's helpful for me and for the audience to maybe go over some terminology, because there are some things that are gray, and then there are obviously some things that are not remotely gray. So what is sexual violence, sexual misconduct, sexual abuse? What terms do you think are important for people to have proper understanding of when engaging in this conversation?
Yeah. So I'd say sexual violence is always kind of a starting place. Sexual violence is such an umbrella term, and that's why people struggle with it a lot, because sexual violence is every single behavior. So a lot of times it can be violent penetrative rape. It can be sexual assault. It can be things like intimate partner violence, dating violence, or domestic violence, right? Where it's happening between two individuals in some kind of relationship, however that relationship is defined. Sexual violence includes stalking, like what I went through. It is also things like, taking someone's photos without their permission, or taking videos without their permission, or sending even photos or nudes without permission, right? And so sexual violence is such an umbrella term that I think a lot of times people hear statistics around it, because you'll hear those statistics of like 1 in 3 women will experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. And when you hear that, people's minds go to generally violent penetrative rape. And really in the
That's where my
80s,
mind.
yeah,
That's where
right?
my mind went when you said that. Yeah.
Well, and it's because of like past administrations. So like in the 80s, there were some federal laws that were codified that were essentially really focused on that astringent idea. And what society was taught is that sexual violence was being caused by men in dark alleys who were jumping out with a weapon in the middle of the night if you walk down the wrong street. That's a form of sexual violence, yes, and it does happen. Stranger rape does happen, but it's fairly uncommon compared to other versions, right? But because of that, we were missing all these other behaviors, and we were missing all these other actions. So like sexual misconduct, generally when you're talking about sexual misconduct, those are things that are crossing a line of appropriateness. They're moving into this place where, like catcalling is one of those things, right? I would say, like, again, the unsolicited sharing or sending of nude photos or taking nude photos without permission, some of those fall into sexual misconduct, where there may be no physical harm that has occurred, there might be no physical violence that has occurred, but it's still violating someone's boundaries or violating perceptions of consent. And so I think it's important, as you mentioned, we have to know this stuff because it can be very different what someone's going through, but we also have to be very careful not to normalize any of it, because I think that sometimes when you lump it together, people are like, you could talk to everyone and be like, yeah, rape is awful, sexual assault's awful, all these things are awful. But then generally you start to get to the lower end of like misconduct and some of those things of like, well, what about rape jokes? And people are like, well, that's where they want to find that wiggle room. Or like, what about catcalling if you're trying to compliment? And so that's where people try and like build, but those things do contribute to the overall picture of sexual violence. And when we allow any of them, what we tend to see is the other ones become normalized as well.
In the Me Too movement, we've seen a lot of people come forward, obviously. And it's not just the Me Too movement. This has been going on for years where people come out about traumas that they need to come out about and should be coming out about. But especially over the last few years, more people have been coming out. We started off kind of with Harvey Weinstein, who is clearly, he's in prison for what he did. It's illegal. And then there's other people who have been exposed for things. And when we talk about that gray area, it's certain cases or certain people where some would say, yeah, well, maybe it falls under the umbrella term, the same umbrella term as Harvey Weinstein, but is it as bad? What do you make of, and this is not to legitimize any, this is by no means to say any of the bad actions that people have done are okay. But I think what some people struggle with is they feel like everything is put under the same umbrella, and that some people who've had indiscretions in the past are getting lumped in with some of the people who've done illegal things. What do you make of that and how it's affected people's views on this topic? Has it been productive in that it's shed so much light on it, or has it been a little bit maybe too categorical that there hasn't been enough room for conversation in some cases?
I think it's a mix of both, to be honest. I think there's times where we need to be having these conversations because when we have good conversations, we're seeing the results, right? So like for just a quick statistic, since 1990s, really, we have cut incidents of sexual violence in our country by half. Part of that is because we know we started to do a better job of it. Even going beyond Me Too, that kind of stems a lot from like the Anita Hill hearing in 1991 of starting to look at like workplace harassment and some of the laws that were passed as a result of that. So I'd say when we talk about it, we do a better job of preventing it and stopping it. To your point, I think that a lot of what we see is frustration of that kind of degree of, well, what are we asking for? And what is the end result? Because we need to change. And I think everyone would agree we need to change. And this isn't okay. And we need to create change around it. I think that sometimes people are afraid of that degree of like, well, there is a difference between someone who is engaging in predatory rape and someone who potentially one time, maybe groped someone or potentially did catcall someone or made that inappropriate comment, whatever it is, right? And people want to know that difference. It is hard to always segment that out because every case is so unique and personal. But I think one thing that's oftentimes lost in this conversation is I think survivors, not to speak for all of us because I can't, but I generally look at it in the capacity of people are always like, well, do you want everyone who's ever done any of these behaviors to automatically go to jail and, face all this stuff? Well, no, but I would say when we look at if 1,000 cases come in, roughly statistically, only five of those cases will ever actually face any prosecution for what they did, right? So if we look at 1,000 rape cases, only 5 of those perpetrators will ever face any kind of jail time or any type of punishment for what they did. And so I think there's there's this, and oftentimes it's because there's clear information, there's like very evidence that you can't refute, there's multiple victims, and a lot of times it's for children who are the victims. And I think what's happening is this is one of the first times where survivors have such an amplification of our voices, where the tools that allow us to speak up are much bigger. And because of that, sometimes the public reacts by lumping people together. But I would say a lot of times, as a survivor, my response is, I want there to be a variety of, I want there to be a variety of also punishment's not necessarily the right word, but holding people accountable for what's going on, right? So if you have someone who's again, Harvey Weinstein or Matt Lauer, right? You have someone who's built a button in his desk to lock people in his room. He doesn't need a job, and we don't need to hire him again. We don't need to give him TV time. We don't need to give him attention. Aziz Ansari had a very public, high-profile incident where there was a date, and there's different sides of that story, and each person saying, "Hey, I thought this was this, and I was restraining that." Is there a different degree of restitution that he should be held to? Yeah. Should there still be a public conversation of is that wrong? Absolutely. And I think the other thing is when we get so caught up in high-profile cases, we miss out on some of the societal factors that contribute to those things occurring. Sexual violence does occur because of individuals who choose to make those choices, but there's all these societal factors that also go into sexual violence. And I think as long as we continue to gravitate towards those lightning rods, we're missing out on all these other behaviors that we could be addressing if we were having a little bit more of a productive conversation.
I think those were really great examples you gave in terms of the spectrum there of Harvey Weinstein, Matt Lauer, and Aziz Ansari. Aziz Ansari was an interesting, sounds weird saying, an interesting one in the sense that a lot of people, and I don't know all the details of it, so nobody does, but that's what I was going to say. There was a lot of he said, she said in that, or misinterpretation of consent, misinterpretation of, well, I thought this was okay when I was doing it. And maybe not even in that case, but in a lot of cases, there's a lot of, well, how do we know what actually happened? What was the truth? That makes this topic so challenging. So I think to understand that, it's important to understand what consent really is. What's your thoughts on consent and how that relates to people's he says, she says, or different interpretations of the same event?
Yeah, we have done a terrible job across the country, if not the world, of talking about consent. And because of that, it leads to so many of the situations, right? Predatory individuals aside who choose to engage in this behavior, we are seeing a number of cases where people don't fully understand the complexity of consent. And you'll hear the idea of enthusiastic. So yes has to mean yes. It has to be loudly, clearly said to every behavior. That's where people are leaning. I tend to avoid that because I think that there are times where what I always like to look at consent is I look at ethical consent versus legal consent versus human consent. And my goal for anyone is to engage in consent that is both human and ethical, understanding if you're doing that, it's always probably going to be legal as well. But the reason I say that is for example, on the legal side of things, up until the early 1990s, spousal rape was not a crime. So up until the 1990s, it was in our country and a few states held out till the end. There was this idea that if you're married to someone, they can't rape you, right? And even then, some states still after that fact had it. So there had to be clear physical violence. And that's a legal definition that isn't right. Another legal definition for today's standards, Texas right now is the only state, to my knowledge, that has criminalized the sending of unsolicited nude photos. And so if you send an unsolicited nude photo, it is now a misdemeanor in Texas. And I think that's good because we know 1 in 4 women will receive an unsolicited dick pic in their lifetime. Oftentimes it's aggressive and it leads to further harassment or things like that. There's no reason to send one if you don't have permission to send one, right? I mean, that's pretty clearly provable. Like the conversation's going to reflect like, hey, this person asked for it or they didn't, kind of thing. But by making that a misdemeanor, we're saying like, hey, there's some punishment that goes with it, whether it's community service, education, whether there is a fine that's involved in it to teach people not to do this. But right now we have 1 state out of 50 that has now done that. So legally, there's some places where it's still not illegal to violate someone's consent and send a dick pic without permission. And that still needs to be a kind of conversation. So then that's where I look at the ethical and the human side. The ethical side for me is always, how does your partner feel about what you're engaging in? And what is the perceptions that they feel? And how are you paying attention to that? How are you listening to that? How are you making sure you're respecting that? And so ethically for me is really this idea of, what cues are you watching? And I think even like with the Aziz Ansari, that's the prime example where I think some people do get frustrated of like Aziz Ansari painted himself as this like relationship expert. And so there's this kind of mindset of like, if you're going to get on stage and talk about how good you are at relationships, you're probably better at reading nonverbal and verbal cues, right? But so for ethical, it's always, how does our partner feel? And what does that mean? And I think ethically is especially important because it takes into account history and the history that you have with someone. Ethically, it is much easier for me to understand my wife's boundaries of consent than it would for me to understand a stranger's, because I have an established history with her. We know each other. We have an established relationship. We understand these things. Versus if you don't know someone, it's much harder to understand and respect those. And then there's that human side, because human side goes into the degree of we need to make sure we are also accounting for the fact that sometimes people engage in behaviors based on the societal constructs we're in. So right now, for example, like when we look at Generation Z, especially aged 18 to like 24-ish, we know about 67% of Generation Z is comfortable hooking up or having sex while drinking or using drugs. That also means 33% is not. Well, we know a lot of states, if you reach a certain line of intoxication, you cannot legally give consent. And we also know there's a number of situations where if you take certain drugs, you have legally crossed that line of incapacitation, right? And I would say that from an ethical place, it's hard to navigate that. But if 67% of our society, or a certain population of our society is okay with this, how are we talking to them? Because if I walk into a room and I'm talking to Generation Z and I say, hey, if you use any of the following substances and engage in sex, that is not consensual, they check out. And they look at me and say, well, I just did that with my partner last weekend. I went to a concert and did that, and I feel fine. I was at a tailgate, and I'm okay with it. I choose to engage in this behavior. And that's where we have to start to understand the human side, which is always warped by not just the individual, but more so all these social constructs around us. Like, what about our social culture is teaching us this is the norm, or this is okay, or this is accepted? And so we have to wrap all three into it of like, how are people actually behaving? Are people respecting their partners and respecting their partner's boundaries and needs, and knowing that that's more difficult the less you know someone? And then how is that following the letter of the law?
It's super complex, especially when you're talking about the common cases where two people don't really know each other that well. So let's take an example of a first date. Two people go out on a Saturday night. They go for drinks. Very common, obviously. Let's say the guy, and I'm using specific gender roles here, but I don't mean to stereotype, just for ease of conversation. Guy says to the female, hey, do you want to come up and have another drink at my place? And he's not really sure. For example, is she into me or not? And that's a way of gauging it. Let's say the girl comes upstairs and then he makes a move, tries to kiss her. And at what, it's just so challenging. Like, should the guy be saying, can I kiss you? Or is it perceived consent if you go in to kiss somebody and they kiss you back? If there's other escalations of the hooking up, at what stage do you need to say, are you okay with this? Should you say that right at the beginning? If they've already had alcohol, should this be a conversation that's had before the date's even taken place?
Yeah, I think and that's the hard thing is it's so varied, right? And every single person can have a different perception of what they're comfortable with based on their own values and based on their own boundaries and perceptions of what they want from a consensual relationship. I would say generally when we're with strangers, we want to err on the side of caution, and we really want to make sure, I think to your point, yeah, absolutely ask like, hey, can I kiss you? Is that okay if I can do this? I think when we look at like talking about sexual behavior, I think a lot of times people are like, oh, well, that'll kill the mood, that'll make it worse, that'll make all these things. And I think it's trying to reframe for people. You can do that in a way that's sexy. Like, I'm not going to tell you how to do that right now because I don't know who it is. I don't know the situation, right? I'm not there in that moment. But I think a lot of times people are so afraid of like this mindset of, if I ask, that's going to change things. And I think I would challenge no. Like, even if you're with a stranger, I think in an overwhelming majority of sexual encounters, if you don't know someone and you show them that you care about their pleasure and you care about them as an individual, it's probably going to be actually more arousing because you're pausing to say like, hey, is this okay? Is this fine? Can we do this? Can we engage in this? I think some of it is owning up to and recognizing like social cues, similar to as we talked about before. It's kind of that idea of like, there's even these further complex power dynamics in there, right? So, to take it a step back, it's like, okay, so they go out to the bar and grab a drink. Who picked that bar? Do both people feel comfortable? Was it like, I go here all the time, so then all of a sudden one person feels like they're almost ingratiated or in debt to the other person? How did they end up at someone's apartment? Was it because it was the closest person? Did they have to walk somewhere? Was there an Uber ride? Like all of that kind of stuff, right? Or like even looking at the setup of the room. So let's say, you walk into a room and it's a studio and there's one place to sit and it's the bed. Well, what does that communicate about those individuals? Like, if you sit on the bed, is that showing that you want to engage in sexual activity, or is it just because it's the only convenient place to sit, right? And so like all of that can play into it, which I know doesn't really answer your question because it's so damn difficult, right?
No, but
It's like,
it's challenging, but I think a couple things. One, the notion that it's not sexy to ask, "Can I kiss you?" I think you make a really good point there. That it shows a lot of confidence. It shows confidence, it shows respect to the girl or to the partner that you're making a move on. And I think that it might be a false narrative that people say you're taking all the spontaneity out of sexual encounters if you incorporate consent into it. I think a lot of people listening to this are probably thinking back on their own experiences. I know just having this conversation, I'm thinking back on my own experiences when I was dating. These are all very natural encounters where most of us have gone out for a couple drinks with someone and been on a date and wondered, is this going to go anywhere? And they're all very natural encounters, which is what makes the topic so important to talk about because everybody can relate to it. And it's important that we're trying to establish boundaries. It's just like there is no answer to all this stuff.
yeah. One of the best things I would say is with that, the term boundary, I was always tell people, figure out what your values and boundaries are, right? So like that value I shared earlier of 67% is comfortable hooking up or having sex while drinking or using drugs. That's a sexual value. Our values generally dictate what type of behavior we're going to engage in and when we're going to engage in it with them, right? So like, hey, some people say I want to be in a monogamous relationship. Some people say I'm comfortable doing this after a first date. Some people say I'll do certain things, but not other, right? So I'd say figure out your own values of what you value and what you want, and figure out your boundaries and learn how to communicate those boundaries, because that really can set the tone. Like if you're with a partner and you want to make sure you're respecting their boundaries, a great way to set that is to set your own, because that shows like, I'm open to this conversation, I'm welcome to this conversation. It also gives you an idea of how they respond to you, and anyone can do that, and everyone can do that in those kind of situations. And as mentioned earlier, it can happen much sooner, right? So like this can be when you're setting up the date. One of those boundaries might be like, hey, I'm really excited to meet you. This is the first date, fantastic. Right now, because of COVID, I'm vaccinated, but I still don't like going inside of restaurants. So like, I would really prefer if we can only go to an outdoor area, or like, hey, I just want to be up front. Like, I really like you. And like, regardless of how things go, like, I would like to stay to a 2-drink maximum, so there's all these type of things that we can start to build in that gives people this idea of like, hey, this person has thought a little bit about what they want from this. And if they're sharing this information, it's probably okay if I'm sharing this information as well.
That's a useful framework. One place where my mind goes is college, university, where there's huge parties or people are just going to bars and people are getting really, really drunk and intoxicated. And what you said before, that it's actually illegal if you're intoxicated beyond a certain point to have sexual intercourse. So what would you say to any college kids who are listening to this, who are thinking, how do I navigate college? How do I try to meet people and be sexually involved with people when a natural place for a lot of us to meet is out when we're all drunk?
Yeah. I would say it's taking that idea of boundaries and applying it to the people that are around you. So especially your friends and peers. Like, so who are the people you're going out with, right? So not the people you're trying to like go home with, but who are the friends that you're going to grab drinks with? Who are those people you're headed to the party or the tailgate with or whatever it is, right? Or the house party. And have you had this conversation with them? Have you talked with them openly about like, hey, I'm really not into hooking up with people when I'm drinking. So that way they know that if the night rolls around and all of a sudden you're pretty drunk and it seems like you're okay with it, now all of a sudden you're drinking and your inhibitions are lowered, your best friend can come up to you and be like, hey, we've talked about this. Like, we've had this conversation. Like, let's get their phone number and do something else, right? Like, let's go grab like late night food with them, to remove that person from that situation. I think it can feel much more difficult of like, oh my God, there's all these people I don't know. And we're in these huge, settings and environments where there's all these people consuming all these drugs and alcohol. And so I think sometimes it's taking that step back and saying like, okay, who am I going to be going with? And how can I talk with these people about supporting me? And how can I talk with these people about supporting me in the moment as well as after? So the next day we can have that healthy conversation of like, hey, I know you did go home with someone last night. How are you feeling? How was the experience? Are you okay? Kind of thing. And then also the challenge, right? Like that, hey, whether you realize it or not, like you were hitting on someone and you kept buying them shots. Like, and that's, like that was a tiny person and they probably were already drunk and you just kept buying them shots. And like you were doing it because you thought you were having a good time, but then you were trying to like go home with them. And that's not okay because they were just way too drunk, right? I think that especially within college environments, people are exploring their sexual identities and we have made it so taboo to talk about what they want and what they're looking for that they're sometimes doing it in private and they're doing it by trial and error. And this is where a lot of those times where people who are engaging in sexual violence or committing acts of sexual violence, where they may not realize they've committed an act of harm. And that doesn't take away anything that they've done. Because like every time I do a college program, especially, I will always have students come up to me and be like, I thought we were on the same page. I would never want to do this to someone. I would never intend to do this to someone. I thought they enjoyed it. And I always have to clarify for them, like, I get that. But like, if you did, it doesn't take away what your intentions were. It doesn't take away what you thought was happening. It doesn't take away your own misreading of a situation. You've hurt someone, and that can be traumatizing for that individual. And that can be a variable degree of harm for them.
So if two people are drunk at a bar and let's say college or wherever, and they go home and then it's, they go home together and they have sex. And then it's he says versus she says situation in which, and they're almost uncomfortable examples to talk about because I'm not condoning any of this. I'm just trying to understand. But the girl then says, I didn't want to do that. The guy says, well, it seemed like you wanted to do that at the time. The reality is legally, if they were both intoxicated, that is not something that legally should have happened. Is that what you're saying? And that the guy, if a woman says that, regardless how she felt at the time, and she does have genuine regret the next day, that regret, first of all, is obviously fair. That's the way the woman's feeling. But that regret is also legally predicated on the fact that they shouldn't have been in that situation together.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question because I think so many people are afraid of this and so many people misread it. So I will say first and foremost, Title IX, which exists and adjudicates sexual violence on college campuses, is different than the law. And generally, like standards for Title IX are very differently applied in the way they're seeking out evidence and the standard and the burden of proof and all of those type of pieces, right? In almost every courtroom across the country, if you have a situation where you have individuals who show that they were equal levels of impairment and they were both to that point of intoxication, the case is dismissed. And generally that's what is going to happen. Like if you have two individuals who can both show, like, so let's say you bring in friends and witnesses and everyone's like, yeah, that dude vomited and then, and she was slurring her words and then they went home. Generally what's going to happen is there's going to be a conversation of both of these individuals were impaired and then they were to this place of intoxication. And so because generally when you're looking at applying that idea of like intoxication, it's that a reasonable person would be able to understand that they are intoxicated. And so a lot of times when that case comes up in like legal courtrooms, the reaction is we can't necessarily punish this. We can't do anything about this, right? Because there's a degree of like both were intoxicated. Colleges adjudicate that a little differently. And this is somewhat changing. It's it is being changed where now I would say there was some blowback of like, there were a number of high profile cases that came out that caused a lot of that fear, where two equally intoxicated people came in, both of them admitted to blacking out, both of them admitted to not knowing what happened. And because one of them filed the complaint, the other person was punished. It's tending to move away from that, and some of that nuance is coming back in. I think the issue you a lot of times see, and this is especially why when we talk about, gender, and again, I know it's not a gendered conversation, but generally, that 90% of individuals who commit assault are men. So that's some of it. That's where we have to look at some of the societal aspects of it versus also some of the just like human aspects of it, of like, some of this issue comes up of, if you're a 100-pound female and you have 2 shots within an hour, that is enough to raise your BAC nearing the point of blackout. So that's where sometimes those situations come on. Of like, if you go to a cocktail bar and you're a guy and you're with a woman, that you each have 2 cocktails, you're at very different places. So that's one of the issues we sometimes see. I think the other issue we a lot of times see is that we're not talking about all those societal pressures and factors that go into condoning and allowing these things to happen. So for example, like a lot of men are socialized growing up that your value is tied to your sex and the amount of sex that you're having, especially heteronormative sex. So for like a lot of men, when you're socialized that way, you were taught to willfully ignore cues that your partner wasn't actually into you and that your partner wasn't actually consenting for things, but you're much more likely to bypass those cues. Or another example, when it comes to like people stepping in on behalf of their friends, we know men are less likely to engage in bystander intervention. So they're less likely to approach a friend when they can tell the person that person's going home with is too drunk, because they don't want to be a cock blocker. They don't want to stop their friend from having sex. So I think that's some of the unique societal aspects of it that lead to some of those pieces, because it is that degree of, we just have built a society and we built a culture where, men are commodifying sex, they're valuing it, they're taught those things, whether they believe it or not, they're taught those things time and time again. And so a lot of times they're engaging in behaviors that you're choosing to ignore. And then the other thing I would say for some people who are afraid of that kind of stuff is, it is possible to have bad sex with someone and for that to never come forward. There's for every story I hear of those type of examples, I have also countless stories of survivors who've talked to me about, yeah, I was too drunk and I'm not okay with that. But like, I also understand that in my capacity, I'm not going to call it sexual assault. Like, I am not okay with it. It's not what I value. It's not what I want. We are both extremely intoxicated. And I think that's where it starts to look into what is that level of intoxication, which is, again, where it's so hard, right? Is it a difference between he had 2 beers and they had 6 cocktails? And that's clearly predatory, because you should be able to tell, like, we're in a very different level versus, hey, we went shot for shot. Neither of us really remembers things, but, it's not great, and we're not going to talk about it the next day, and we're not going to see each other again, and we're not okay with it. But we can walk away from that encounter and say, okay, like, wasn't great sex, wasn't enjoyable sex, but I'm also not going to define it as assault, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think what you said earlier about establishing your own values and knowing those is really important. And some people listening to this might say it's unrealistic because we're indoctrinated that it's normal, that in culture, it's unrealistic to say people aren't going to go out, get hammered, and hook up. But what you're saying is, well, maybe that can be avoided. Maybe people can be a little bit more cognizant of what they're doing before they go out. Maybe it can be more in the minds of people who are in college or people going on a date saying, yeah, you know what, that's not okay. I am not going to get trashed and then anticipate any sort of hooking up, and just be a little bit more aware of those boundaries. Because as soon as you're a little bit more aware of those values, which hopefully most of us have, then that can prevent you from putting yourself into a situation where it's normal that you're going to go out, get trashed, and hook up with someone.
Yeah. And I would even go further and say, my ideal world is one where we just start having this damn conversation, and we talk about consent, we talk about sex, we talk about all these things, so that we know how to have better conversations around this. And we know how to better articulate it to our partners and to our friends and our peer groups. And we can talk about sex without feeling as taboo. There's been a number of recent developments in sex education, especially happening with like younger populations. And they're finding that the more we train populations around sex, especially this idea of like, how are you ethically treating your partner, and are you valuing your partner as a human, not just as a sex object, but as a human. And it reduces incidents of sexual violence, because it goes from this competition, it goes from this physical behavior, it goes to like, how am I treating this person in front of me? And we have to start young with that, and we have to start young in how we're teaching that, but it's working. And I think that that's where this becomes such a hard issue, is that in so many gray area situations, there's the situation that involve those individuals, and then there's all these other societal factors that just like contribute to it and pack in upon it and add to these things that it's hard to talk about. It's hard to always break through and understand like what's coming from where, but we have to do that.
So how do we, because I know you're very involved in education and having a role in preventing sexual violence. What do guys need to do to educate themselves better? What are some of the steps that we need to be doing to make guys understand the female perspective better and be more aware of these issues? Because we have a long way to go.
Yeah. I would say understand that even if you do not think you're engaging in or perpetrating sexual violence, there are pieces of the masculine culture that just allow and enable sexual violence. So it's one of those things of like, so if you're listening to this and you're like, I've never sent an unsolicited dick pic, I have never badgered someone for nudes, if someone says no, I stop immediately, I've never made a rape joke, it's great. That's a fantastic start. How are you also looking at that in the communities around you? So like, sure, you're not doing that, but are you also having that conversation with your friends and your peers? Are there certain places where you're allowing and normalizing language to be like, oh, it's just a joke, but I would never say this in public or to a partner. But if it happens in the guys group chat, who cares? It's just a meme. You know what I mean? It's like coming in and looking at some of those pieces of like, how are you communicating around sex, especially in your male relationships with other guys, and like, what are the ways that you're talking about it? What are the conversations you're having around it? And then I think it's talking with I think just taking a step back, and if and when you are engaging in sexual activity, it's really focused on like, what does my partner want and need in these moments, and what ways can I make sure that they feel safe, but also get pleasure, right? I think because ideally, when we talk about sex from a pleasure standpoint, and we're willing to have conversations about sex from a pleasure standpoint, it does the job of consent. Because if we're actually seeking that out and we're actually listening to what our partner wants and desires, it's going to lead to better sex, but it's also going to lead to better consensual sex. And so I think step one is talk within your masculine friend groups, especially of like, how are you having conversations around sex? And what stories are you telling? Do those stories change based on your environment? If one of your guys goes home with someone, what do you say to their face versus their back? What do you say about the person they went home with? How are you talking about women in public? And then look at how in your own relationships, how are you centering and listening and focused on the pleasure of your partner and the needs of your partner and what they want? And don't be afraid to ask those questions, right? Like, even if it's a date, if things start to get to that point, pausing and slowing down and, asking a potential partner, like, hey, what do you like? Hey, like, and again, we don't have to use these like clinical terms. Like, it doesn't have to be like, it can be like, I'm so turned on by you. You're so sexy. I really want to touch you here. Is that okay? How can I touch you here? What would you like? What can I do in these kind of ways, right? You have to make it what it is, but over communicating when it comes to sex is generally never going to lead to a bad experience, because you're going to show your partner, wow, this person cares about me and they care about my needs and they care about what I want. So I say, get better at communicating around sex, including your own boundaries, especially for a lot of guys. I think many men don't always think about like what they want and what they need. Learn how to communicate that. Learn how to talk about that stuff. Look inwards a little bit at first, because if you bring that into your relationships, it kind of shows like, hey, this is the type of conversation we're going to have.
Tim, I think that's phenomenal insight. I think obviously based on your personal experiences struggling through what you did and then doing all the work you have in educating on this topic, it's very clear that you've thought this through and you have a framework to deal with a topic that's really messy and complex, and there aren't going to be sharp answers. And like you said, a lot of it's just, you got to be able to read people. And if you can't read somebody, then err on the side of caution. And if you're not sure, even if you are sure, just be confident, be bold enough and ask what somebody wants, because that's how you prevent this kind of stuff from happening.
Yeah.
Tim, do you have any final thoughts on this topic that you want people to hear?
Yeah. If someone comes to you and discloses that they have experienced any form of sexual violence, right? I need you to make sure they're safe, especially if it just occurred, make sure they're in a safe place. If they're talking about something in the past, make sure it's a safe time to have that conversation and believe them, really grounded in what they need. When you experience sexual violence, it's a loss of power and control. And it can be very difficult to try and feel like you have lost that power. And so ground your support on the survivor. One of the best questions you can ever ask a survivor is, what do you need? How can I help you? So really focus on them. And that can be for both the immediate in that moment, because sometimes when people disclose, they just want to tell their story, they just want to talk, they just want to get things off their chest. And it can also be for the long term of knowing what resources to recommend for them, what to find for them, things like that. And then I would say just set some boundaries with them of like how they would like you to check in the future, of asking, if I am going to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that, and how and when should I do that? But above all, just believe them. Understand that they've disclosed to you for a reason, and they really need you to be there for them.
And that's one thing we didn't talk so much about the perspective of the survivor, really. And I guess the reason I didn't focus on that is because to me it feels more obvious what they must be going through. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because what is it like for a survivor to come forward and have that strength to come forward and then be told by people, you're just doing this for attention, or I don't know if I really believe that, you were drunk? Because that must be one of the most discouraging feelings possible for somebody who's encountered a sexual violence, who's encountered sexual assault on any level, and then isn't believed or is questioned about their motives of coming forward.
Yeah, it's devastating. It legitimately almost killed me in my own experience, because I was just so wrapped in that shame of not knowing who to talk to and what to do. And it just made me feel like it was my fault for something that someone else did to me. And I think for many survivors, there's a stigma and there's a fear of speaking up, because they're so afraid of how the community is going to react to it and how the people around them are going to react to it. Because you would think, like you said, you would think that nowadays we have this perception of like, I need to be here for this person, I need to support this person. But I think so often, too many times, people try and qualify it or try and find some way out of it, or try and, they try and become this like investigatory body of like, well, I have to learn the truth. And it's like, well, if the truth needs to come out, there's countless channels for that to happen. It's your job to be there for that survivor, because it is very devastating when people don't believe you. And it's very devastating when you feel like you can't speak up. And that's why we know it also continues to be perpetrated, right? So aside from the times where there is that gray area, the times where there are predators who are choosing to engage in this behavior, a lot of times those individuals thrive because they victimize and assault people who feel like they can't speak up without fear of losing something, right? Harvey Weinstein's prime example. He selected individuals who he knew he could hold his power over them. And I think that whenever we have survivors who speak up, it is one of those things that whenever you see that backlash, that for me is always responsible. This is why people didn't speak up. If you watch the backlash, and even I would say in high profile incidences, in high profile cases, like if you're curious about like, why did they wait this long, or why did they not come up soon forward, do some research. Like do some research before you talk about that, because I will tell you, there's a number of people I've cut out of my life because I saw how they responded to other survivors. And I was like, I'm just not going to deal with this person because a public incident occurred. And instead of like actually researching some of the reality behind it, their first reaction was, this person's lying. And so like my response as a survivor is to look at that and say, well, how would they respond if I talk to them further about what I'm going through, right? Or, or sometimes even like, why do you believe me, but not them kind of pieces? Because my story is very public, is a bigger thing. So if you are curious about why survivors wait, or if you're curious about, all those type of things, I would say research it first. There's a lot of information about why that's the case. And as opposed to just sharing that opinion, stop for a second and recognize why it's happening.
Yeah. And in this day and age with Twitter and everything, people are so quick to form opinions, often baselessly. And this is a perfect example of that. Tim, where can people learn more about you, or if they want to get you for a speaking engagement, or where can you direct people to?
Yeah, I would say my website, timmousseau.com, is just the best place to go. I publish stuff up there. I put videos there. It links to all my social media and stuff like that. But generally, most of the stuff I'm putting forward is on my website. So,
Tim, thank you so much for spending this time with me. Like I said before, I think you've done a really, really phenomenal job of breaking down a complex issue. And there are no concrete answers to any of these things, but you've given a lot of wisdom that hopefully people are able to internalize and bring into their daily lives while they're dating, having sexual encounters, or just living life and treating people with respect. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me.
And thank you everybody for listening to another episode of Preconceived. Have a great day.